In the first chapter, Paul deals with the condition of the church there at Thessalonica, telling us about its character in verses 2 and 3, its election by the gospel, verses 4 and 5, and then its work and reputation in verses 6 through verse 10. And we were in verse 8. In which he says, "For from you sounded out the word of the Lord, not only in Macedonia and Achaia, but also in every place your faith to Godward is spread abroad, so that we need not speak anything." The congregation at Thessalonica was evangelistic in nature. And that becomes really the basis for saying in the previous verse that they were examples to all that believe in Macedonia and Achaia. They realized, as all Christians should, that they had been saved to teach others. And notice also we noticed the combination of example and word. They were examples in verse 7. Now then, he's dealing with the word, sounded out, the word. So it takes the combination so many times, both. You have to live what you're saying. One of the great hindrances to the spread of the gospel has always been those who are hypocritical in nature, who would say one thing but act a different way. That they were sending out missionaries to a certain extent. They went everywhere. So that gets us to that aspect of the word of the Lord was sounded out. The word of the Lord first. Probably you've heard the phrases objective genitive and subjective genitive. You hear that a lot in discussing 2 John 9 and the doctrine of Christ. And an objective genitive would be dealing with the person. A subjective genitive would be what the person is saying in relationship to 2 John 9. Whosoever transgresseth and abideth not in the doctrine of Christ. Well, is that the doctrine dealing with Christ and his nature, objective, genitive, or the doctrine which he set forth, which would be subjective, genitive? And I still believe that the only real reason that people try to take an objective genitive in that verse is because they want a wider aspect of fellowship than what the Bible allows. There are those in that verse that say, well, it doesn't really matter either way. And I might have heard this many times, but it finally made an impression on me. It's called the plural genitive. Now then, that in relationship to this is the word of the Lord, subjective genitive. That means the word which has the Lord as its author, that which the Lord teaches. Or would it be objective genitive, that is the word about the Lord, and thus having him as the object of the word. I had always held this pretty much as subjective genitive. It's the word which the Lord sets forth. A.T. Robertson, though, says it's both, and thus would make it a plenary genitive that embraces both objective and subjective. And again, that's what some people hold in relationship to 2 John 9, that it's a plenary genitive that embraces both objective and subjective. I still tend toward the idea that it is more a subjective genitive, even as I do 2 John 9. This is the word which has God or the Lord as its author. But I can understand someone who says both, or plural genitive, plenary genitive actually. And that's a position that I would hold on it. Well, when you're dealing with the Greek language, you have both aspects, and so you have to determine it. Context is the context one or the other, and so it could be from a grammatical standpoint either one. It could be objective, it could be subjective. I think context is basically what you're saying, that it's the word which comes from God that they were spreading out. They had accepted it, they're now teaching it, and thus subjective in nature. Those are grammatical decisions, though, that a lot of times are based. For example, if instead of the word of the Lord, they had translated it the word about the Lord, does that present a different idea? Well, the point is, in translation, you could translate it that way. And thus, that would present a different idea to us. By the translation of the Lord, though, it tends to make us think the word that the Lord sets forth. Spreading the gospel. That's why I said context, to me, makes it appear as if it is subjective in nature and not objective. Carl?
Yeah, because just the tone of your voice changes the meaning of words. So
Oh, sure.
say something to change what that word means. Just like you can be angry and not sin, and you can be angry and sin.
And that's one of the great problems with social media, isn't it? You don't get that inflection, that tone that someone is using, and sometimes you think someone's mad and they're not. I remember in a conversation that I was having with someone, or discussion, and they said, I didn't mean to offend you. And I said, I'm not offended. You hadn't offended me in the least. But they took what I wrote in that way, that I was somehow offended. I wasn't. So you miss that in social media a lot of times, but it is important because it does change things like that. Whereas in speaking face to face, I think they probably would have known I wasn't upset. So yes, tone, facial expression, everything else can change our view of what is being said. The faith that he speaks of here had been turned, or their faith had been turned to God and away from idols. Look at verse 10 when he says, "And to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, even Jesus, which delivered us from the wrath to come." I should have put verse 9 instead of 10. "For they themselves show us what manner of entering in we had unto you, how you turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God." So they had been turned to God away from idols. And as a result, their faith had spread abroad. As Paul traveled, as he did extensively, he did not need to tell others about the Thessalonians' faith. They already knew it. But in every place, your faith to God were to spread abroad, so that we need not speak anything. The phrase "spread abroad" there, if you still have that Greek help that I gave you, it's perfect tense. A completed action that has continuing results. It's thus their faith basically is still being discussed. They knew about it, and it's still being discussed. When Paul says that we need not speak, the word "speak" is present tense, where it's continuous action. So they knew it. There was no need for Paul to continuously speak about it, because they already knew it and they were already talking about it. Do we ever do that in relationship to others' faith? When Brother Rice would come back and make reports, wasn't it to a great extent discussing the faith of those where he had been? And if, for example, with him, if you read his reports, you might have known those things when he got here, and there really wouldn't have been any need for him to speak about them per se, but for those who might not have known. So that's the situation with Paul. Paul would go out, wouldn't even need to speak about the Thessalonians' faith because they already knew about it, and they were discussing it. So he didn't have to continue to talk about it. Carl, you wanted to...
You think it might be a way for them to try to make the apostles look more like us? Like they were just handling God's word just like we do? Like using both terms like that?
I don't really understand what totally you're talking about in regards to that. Is
They're using a different objective and subjective. You know, we're saying that it's God's word. And
yeah.
they're using God's word, or it's from God. You know, so it makes it look like they weren't inspired. That's what it sounds like. To me, they're trying to put them on the same level. So it's not.
You mean in using the if someone using an objective genitive?
Yeah, without the context.
Well, subjective would be his word, the word that he set forth, the word he preached or taught. If it's about him, though, and his lordship And this is why a lot of people say it's both. It doesn't really matter. If you're dealing with his lordship, then what he says carries authority. It would carry the weight of being God. And so they would have to obey it and be subject themselves to him and his will. So if it's about the Lord and his nature, it would deal with his deity. It would deal with his being the God-man and thus humanity. It would deal with his sacrificial nature and all of those aspects of him being Lord. And so it would not really in any way denigrate that aspect or humanize it as if it wasn't, the Word of God or what he said. Some would say, in fact, being an objective genitive word about the Lord, that actually would be a stronger aspect in relationship to what he actually said and taught. It's not just the word from him and what he says, but now then you're dealing with his nature, and since his nature is that of being Lord and everything that embraces, you would be saying you have to be obedient to him. So it might, in relationship to that, make it a little bit stronger aspect than just simply saying it is the word which came from him, that which he taught.
Just from talking with these younger people that are coming out of these Christian colleges, it just seems like they can pick and choose who they want to, which one of the apostles they want to follow.
Well, they don't want to follow any of them.
I didn't know if that's one way they were trying to.
No, I don't think so. Because all of the apostles taught the same thing. So any argument that they might use, I use that word argument very loosely in that case because it's not it's not going to accomplish anything because they all taught the same thing, they all acted the same way.
That's why I was because they don't know. They're just being taught this false doctrine. They're not being taught everything, so they don't realize that they all don't do the same.
I've never really heard anyone approach that aspect of it other than the old denominational idea of a Petrine gospel as opposed to a Pauline gospel. Since Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles, he taught one thing. Peter was the apostle to the Jews, and thus he taught something else. And thus what we have to the Jews, we don't have to obey, because that was to the Jews. And Paul taught a gospel of grace and not a gospel of law.
Even if you're preaching about Jesus,
You preach Jesus to him.
how did he know to be baptized?
Yeah.
What Jesus was about?
You have to, in teaching about Jesus, you have to teach about everything. In teaching about the Lord, and that's the point that I was trying to make. In teaching about the Lord, you have to teach everything that the Lord said, because he is the Lord, and thus his word would have to be obeyed. We would have to submit ourselves to him. And so it being an objective genitive can certainly be understood within the context, even though I don't believe that's what it's talking about. But some would explain it away in that way.
They don't go at it that way. They just say,
Yeah, as long as and this goes back to 2 John 9 and the doctrine of Christ. If it is the doctrine just about him, then they would teach, and what they will teach is that as long as you believe that Jesus is the Christ, then that's all that's necessary. And we have then fellowship with God, and we should fellowship each other. That is way too broad. It is the doctrine which he set forth, which he taught, and thus if we transgress that doctrine, not just the doctrine about him and his deity, but what he taught, then we have not God. Only as we remain within that doctrine of Christ do we have the Father and Son. That's why I said I've never seen anyone who really argued the objective genitive in 2 John 9 without the reason being they want a broader definition of fellowship than what the Bible really allows. Because they would, and that goes back to the idea of the core gospel or the bullseye gospel, that you have a core teaching here. That's the bullseye. And think of it, an archer shooting at a bullseye, and you got the bullseye there, and then you got rings outside of it. Those rings are not as important as the bullseye. As long as you've got the bullseye, which would be the deity of Jesus, then everything else is just a matter of peripheral. Doesn't really matter. And so if you believe in premillennialism, if you believe in Pentecostalism, if you believe in all of these other things that are false doctrine, well, that's just a matter of, on the outside rings. It's not really important, and it's not going to affect our fellowship, which is based upon the bullseye. That's the idea of bullseye gospel or the core gospel. And that's just false. In 2 John, they would thus try and teach 2 John 9, the doctrine would be about Christ, not what all he taught. And so if you believe in Jesus as being God's Son, that's all that's important. That's the bullseye. Now then, that is in reality what the denominational world tries to do in relationship to this ecumenical movement. Why, you believe the deity of Jesus, so we're going to have fellowship. We're going to be in unity and harmony. Well, I don't believe the same thing you do. Well, that doesn't matter. You believe in the deity of Jesus, that's all that's necessary. And so one group tries to have fellowship with the others. David Lipscomb wrote, coming back to here in verse 8, the loudest, clearest, most eloquent, and most unanswerable proclamation of the gospel is the unconscious testimony of Christian living. It may be sounded forth in great power in the midst of the severest afflictions, and often is, end quote. That goes back to what I said at the beginning about one of the great hindrances of the spread of the gospel is people who say one thing but live something else. They're hypocrites. The example that they gave can be far more influential than what they say. How many have heard the expression, I'd rather see a sermon than hear one any day? That's what he's saying, and that's what is happening here. They are both, yes, they are giving that great example, but they are also sounding out the word. Raymond Kelsey he pointed out that the writers are not necessarily saying that the members of the Thessalonian church had evangelized all of this area. They seem rather to be saying that Thessalonica, a city strategically located on the Egnatian Road as well as on a harbor, had become a sounding board from which reports went in all directions. And goes on to say, financial aid sent elsewhere was one means whereby this was accomplished, 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 9. And then he concludes, what was happening was that others were going to various places and carrying reports about the faith of these Christians. What a great testimony to these Christians, these Thessalonians, that people were leaving and going from Thessalonica and going other places and telling about their faith. Yes, they would be teaching the gospel. It's not devoid of the gospel and teaching the gospel, but you could tell others about, here's what the Thessalonians are going through. They obeyed the gospel. They turned from idols to serve God. They are being afflicted, suffering persecution. Do we ever talk about those who are Christians who are suffering persecutions today? Oh yeah, we do, don't we? Well, same type of idea, except, of course, they don't have the internet to sound it out, but individuals would leave Thessalonica, being on that Egnatian Way and on a harbor, so by land and by sea, if you want to put it that way, people coming through Thessalonica, seeing their faith, experiencing what they are experiencing, and as they would continue on, they would tell others about it. That's a great testimony to these Thessalonians. And yet it's what all congregations should be and should be like. Yeah, everybody's a preacher, whether they like it or not. Congregations, and since we're dealing with the congregational aspect here, congregations are likewise to be preachers, sounding out the word of the Lord. People should be able to come through and see the faith that we have. Be able to go and take it elsewhere and tell others about it. Yeah. And a great deal of that was as a result of Brother Rice and others, but he was a great influence in regards to that. They still, a lot of places still know our name. And a lot of people, and I'll just put it this way, a lot of people overseas watch the videos that we put out. I mean, we're putting them out on YouTube, on Facebook, on Rumble, and other places. And they are being watched. A lot of people overseas watch those. I get requests on a regular basis. We want you to teach us. They always want a live class, though, because I tell them I've got classes on YouTube page. Go there and go through them. We want you to teach live. Not turn that down. If you're not willing to go through the material that's already there, then, but that's another matter. But the point is, they see the material. They use the material. I was contacted by one just this past week over something that I wrote a long time ago and reposted it on Facebook. They took it and translated it into another language, and they're using it with the preachers in their area. And will they know us? Yeah, to a certain extent, they will. Yeah. I'm not sure Bill's email address is on the website, though. We need to get his in there. Yeah, so he can get some of these requests too. But yeah, I know ours is, and so we get these comments on a regular basis. Yeah. But they are looking at it. So basically the point is, though, that every congregation ought to be doing this. Now then, let me alter that a little bit. Every sound congregation should be doing this. And I wish those who were not sound, we could just take the name off of their building and off of all of their information and let everyone know they're part of the denominational world. So, verse 9 then, Paul says, "For they themselves show of us what manner of entering in we had unto you, and how you turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God." The people of Macedonia and Achaia had voluntarily been reporting their success. That's why Paul didn't have to speak anything about it in verse 8. Show here, they themselves show of us, is a word which is defined by Thayer as to bring tidings from a person or a thing, bring word or report. And then his second definition was to proclaim. And he uses the word apo, which and because he uses that term, let me explain it. There's two words which are translated correctly from. Ek, we know, is out from within. The ecclesia, the church, called out from within. We were in darkness and we've been called out of that into the marvelous light of Christ. That's ek. Apo, on the other hand, also translated from, but the point of departure is different. With ek, the point of departure is, if you think of a circle, ek is being inside that circle and departing. Apo would be from the edge of the circle and going from it. So he uses to proclaim, and then in parentheses he states apo, because of what one announces, he openly lays, as it were, from off himself. And then he goes on to make known openly or declare. So others are continuing to declare the situation as to Paul's reception and the Thessalonians' obedience. They themselves show what manner of entering in we had unto you. So people are continuing to show this. They're declaring it to others. Paul's reception and the Thessalonians' obedience. In this verse, though, we see the power of the gospel. We talk a great deal about Romans 1:16. I'm not ashamed of the not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God and the salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. The gospel is God's power. God's power to do what? To save? Certainly. That's part of it. Is that all of it? What about the power to change someone's life? Talk about Romans the 6th chapter, for example. What were they doing? They were baptized, and in that baptism they were dying to the old man of sin, and they were being raised to do what? Walk in newness of life. Isn't that a changed life? The gospel has the power to save our souls, but it also has the power to change the life. In the Thessalonians, you see both of those aspects. They turned to God from idols. That's what their old life was, idolatry. But the gospel was able to change their lives so that they now serve the true and living God. You see the same thing in James 1 and verse 21, where James would say, wherefore lay apart all filthiness and superfluity of naughtiness, and receive with meekness the engrafted word which is able to save your souls. The idea of saving your souls, the ability, the power to save your souls. But what does he say? You lay apart the filthiness and superfluity of naughtiness. I can't help myself. I've got to add this. Sometimes you get into a discussion of drinking socially, which is unsocial drinking, but alcoholic beverages. Oh, as long as you don't get drunk, it's okay. Well, no, it's not. And they try to go to the qualifications of elders and deacons. Elders aren't supposed to drink any, but it's all right for the deacons to drink a little bit. And they try to use that phraseology in, well, let me get over there to in 1 Timothy, the 3rd chapter. And where it says not given to much wine, and their conclusion, so you can be given to a little wine and it's all right. Wouldn't that make sense? Right? Surely that makes sense, doesn't it? If you're not to be given to much wine, you can be given, then a little wine would be okay. Well, that's the argument. This in James 1:21, I like to use in response to that. Wherefore, laying apart all filthiness and, what's this phrase? Superfluity of naughtiness. Word superfluity, what does the New King James have on that? Overflowing, okay. The overflowing of naughtiness. No, it's the overflowing, something that flows over. If you got for example, you got a pot there, and you're filling it with water. it finally gets to the point it overflows. So the overflowing of naughtiness or sin would mean as long as it's not overflowing, it's all right then, right? So a little bit of sin, a little bit of naughtiness is all right because that's not overflowing, right? Well, why not? What? Well, good question. When you first engage in the sin, isn't it? Now then, take that same principle back to what is stated in 1 Timothy 3 and verse 8 in relationship to deacons, not given too much wine. Where does the much start? As opposed to the all right. Well, when you take the first drink. That's really the answer. He's saying you stay away from it totally. Just like in James 1:21, the overflowing of naughtiness, stay away from all naughtiness. Don't engage in any of it. Same type of structure. He's not saying that a little bit is okay. None of it is. But notice, this word is able to save your souls, but it's also able to do what in the first part of the verse? Laying apart all filthiness and overflowing of naughtiness. It's able to do that for you.
You were talking about the power of the gospel. Remember, Jesus said it's easier for a camel to go through an eye of needle than a rich man to enter into heaven. That's not a possibility. With God, everything is possible.
Yeah.
That means the gospel is so powerful. That means that it's easier for a camel to get through that eye of needle heart and to change such that he can be seated in it. No matter how hard or good, the gospel can do.
The gospel has the power to save them, no matter what, as long as they change their life. Notice, go back in 1 Thessalonians 1 to verse 5. For our gospel came not unto you in word only, but also in power, and in the Holy Ghost, and in much assurance, as ye know what manner of men we were among you for your sake. So there's the power of the gospel that he's talking about. They turned to God from idolatry, and now they were serving God. Andrew's about to ring the bell, so I'm not going to start into this on repentance, but I'll introduce it. In this, we see a complete or a total picture of repentance and their conversion. But we'll start with that, Lord willing, next time.